Welcome to the second part of Lesson 1. Recall from the reading that in the 14th century, North African scholar Ibn Khaldun wrote the following in the Muqaddimah. At the beginning of the dynasty, taxation yields a large revenue from small assessments. At the end of the dynasty, taxation yields a small revenue from large assessments. This insight suggests that raising tax rates too high can reduce government revenue as people find ways to avoid taxes or reduce economic activity. Back in 1974, economist Art Laffer sketched this relationship on a napkin during a meeting at a Washington, D.C. restaurant with Jude Wanniski, a journalist, and two of President Ford's aides, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Though this relationship should be called the Khaldun curve, it has been known as the Laffer curve. It explains why high tax rates could reduce government revenue by discouraging economic activity or encouraging tax evasion. To illustrate, he drew the curve on the napkin, with tax rates on the x-axis and tax revenue on the y-axis. The curve showed revenue rising to a peak and then declining as higher rates stifled the economy. Suppose a student of Ibn Khaldun discovered the data in the following table while studying ancient Egyptian historical scrolls back in the 14th century. We're going to copy the contents of this table to cells A1 to C4 in Microsoft Excel. Now, of course, back in the 14th century, Excel didn't exist. Neither did the statistical method we're about to employ. When you're copying the contents of an HTML table to Excel, you want to copy the stuff inside the table and then something outside the table. And then over here, you want to right click and choose match destination formatting. I'm going to go ahead and delete the U. Using your mouse, select cells B2 to C4. B2 to C4. Find and click on the XY scatter. I'm using Microsoft Excel desktop, not the online version. I'm going to click on Insert. I'm going to click on Charts, click on Scatter. And the result, 3 dots that appear to be on a line. I'm going to add a trend line. It looks like relationship is linear. All 3 points are on this line. Then I'm going to scroll down and I'll go ahead and click Display Equation on Chart and Display R squared value on chart. I'm going to right click on the equation that Excel gives me and then Format Trend Line Label. Change the number from general to number. And then it says set the decimal places to 4. So I'm going to change this to 4 here. Higher level of accuracy. Then I'll set it aside over here. All right, so N is the Y, and it stands for Egyptian national income in millions of drachma. Drachma is an Egyptian bronze coin that is equivalent to roughly $140 today. And T is the tax rate. If I go up here to this point, you'll see that the tax rate looks like it's about 25% there, and it is. At a 25% tax rate, total national income in Egypt is 261 million drachma. At 0%, total income is 348 million drachma. And then at 50% tax rate, total income is 174 drachma. So the tax rate is having a negative impact on work and entrepreneurialism. The more that the Egyptian people are taxed, the less activity that is being performed within the nation. Now, it could be that the economic activity is being driven under the table. People are doing things off books to hide income. And you see this in New York City. I remember when I was engaged to my wife and we were hanging out in New York and we went to a friend of hers sister's wedding and I needed to get a camera. This is before I had a smartphone. I had a flip phone and it didn't take very good pictures. And I went over to a bodega in New York City, a New York City neighborhood nearby, and I wanted to buy one of those disposable cameras, but the bodega only accepted cash. And as an economist, I'm thinking, why are they only accepting cash? Well, tax rates in New York City are quite high. And so they have these old registers from the 1950s. They only accept cash. And I'm thinking to myself, well, they're probably trying to hide income from the state and the city. The same thing happened at a parking garage in Manhattan. I parked my car nearby in a parking garage in some high rise, and it only accepted cash. And I was trying to figure out why they would only accept cash. What I realized when I picked my car up is that if nothing happened to my car and I had no complaints of the service, the transaction probably never existed on the books, even though it actually happened. Then you look at, and I mentioned this in the previous lesson, I think, you look at the tax rate on cigarettes in New York City. The state and the city's tax rates are so high that most of the cigarettes that are smoked in New York City are illegal. So when you set tax rates as high as New York City and New York State, it drives a lot of the economic activity underground. And if they were just to lower their tax rates, they'd bring a lot of that commerce from under the table to in the light of legal markets. And they would probably actually see higher tax revenues from just people making their transactions legal. So going back to our problem here, this column is N and this column's the T. So what I'll do is I'll put in parentheses N, and then I'll come over here and I'll put parentheses T for tax rate. And then I'll click on word wrap and I'll center it, make it look nice. I'm going to translate this information into the lesson. So the slope is the number that precedes the letter X. So the slope is negative. So I got the negative here. So I only need to bring in the number 348. And the intercept happens to be 348 too. I'll press enter to check that I got it right. If the tax rate is 0%, national income is going to equal what? Well, we already talked about that. But what I'll do is I'll come down here and I'm going to copy the formula here. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it right here. I'm going to replace the X with asterisks for multiplication. Then I'm going to delete the X and then I'm going to click on this cell. So I'm going to change the contents of the blue cell, the blinking blue cell here with various different numbers. If the tax rate is 0%, I'll type 0% here. Total income in the Egyptian nation is 0% times negative 348, which is 0 plus 348. So 348 million drachmas. This is going to be tax revenue, so R, total income, and this is the tax rate. To calculate the tax revenue, you just multiply the national income by the tax rate of 0%. And so if the tax rate is 0%, the government's collecting 0 million drachmas in tax revenue. I'm going to change this to 20% next, 20%. That brings down total income, but revenues rise to 55.68 million drachmas. If the tax rate is 40%, national income, that should be N, national income. National income is 208.8 million drachmas. And 40% of that national income is the tax revenue the government collects. And we're going to continue doing this, keep raising the tax rate. Raising the tax rate either causes people to work less or it's going to drive commerce under the table, just like it does in New York City. And then the tax revenue, 60% of this smaller amount of income, is 83.52%. Notice what happened here. At 40%, national income is 208.8 million. Tax revenue is 83.52 million. At 60%, national income is 139.2 million. And tax revenue is the same as it would have been had the tax rate been kept at 40%. This is an observation that occurred in the 14th century by this North African scholar and recorded in the Muqaddimah. These aren't the actual numbers. These are just for simulation. At 80% tax rate, now national income is down to 69.6. And so you have a huge tax rate and a small income, and your revenues are now on the decline. If Pharaoh sets the tax rate at 100%, one of two things is going to happen. Either no one's going to work at all. There's not going to be any commerce. Why would anybody work if government takes 100% of all your income? So if you work, you have no income. If you don't work, there's no income. So there's zero official commerce in the kingdom. As a result, since there's no official commerce being conducted, no exchanges being made in the economy because they don't want to pay this 100% tax, you're going to have zero income on the official books and zero tax revenue. People need to eat. People need to buy stuff. So what's probably happening here is this 100% tax rate has driven all commerce under the table. Now we're going to click Desmos.com here to draw the Laffer curve that is traced out by the above points. Change the numbers on line 1 to their corresponding values entered in the boxes of the above equation. So we'll open up Desmos and I'm going to type in 348 minus 348. Desmos is a math program, so you generally use Y and X here. The x-axis goes from 0 to 100%. And the vertical axis is in millions of the currency of ancient Egypt, 0 to 348. We're going to put parentheses around this part, and we're going to multiply this by x. And when we do that, it bends this line into what's called a parabola. The parabola rises and falls. So this inside the parentheses is Egyptian national income, which is a function of the tax rate. The higher the tax rate, the more commerce is driven under the table, or the less people generally work. So this blue box is national income. If we multiply income by the tax rate, the result is tax revenue. It rises, peaks, and falls. And you can think of this as the thing that Art Laffer drew on that napkin in that restaurant. The tax rate that maximizes Egyptian tax receipts, well, that's at the peak here, right? If I type in x equal 0.45, I'm also going to do this. I'm going to do a squiggly bracket. I'm going to do y less than or equal to parentheses times x. And then inside the parentheses, I'm going to type 348 minus 348x. And then in front of the y, I'm going to type 0 and then less than or equal to. I'm going to push this into the margin here. Okay, so if the tax rate is 0.45, tax revenues are 86.13. Increasing that to 47% increases tax revenue up to 86.68. Boosting it to 49% increases tax revenues, but not by much. And then changing it to 0.5, we reach the maximum point. We can zoom in on that point there. Tax revenues can't get higher than 87 million. That's the most tax revenues can be, and that corresponds to the tax rate of 0.5. If I lower the tax rate, revenues fall. If I raise the tax rate, revenues fall. So the tax rate that maximizes tax revenue, because this word here is percent, so this is 50%. At this tax rate, click on this point here. The first number, again, is the tax rate. The second number is the tax revenue. So 87 million drachmas will be raised by the Egyptian pharaoh. If pharaoh cuts the tax rate from 80% to 60%, what will happen? So if we're at 80%, tax revenues are 55.68. If we lower it from 80% to 60%, tax revenues are higher, 83.52. So this difference is how much tax receipts increase by. If pharaoh cuts the tax rate from 40 to 20%, so if we go from 40%, tax revenue is 83.52. If we go down to 20%, tax revenue is 55.68, these same numbers. So when the tax rates are cut from 0.4 to 0.2, from 40% to 20%, tax revenue declines by 27.84. At a tax rate of 100%, you can't see it. At 0.98%, look how low tax revenues have gotten, the height of the red bar. If we go to 99%, the height of the red bar is even smaller. 99.5%, the height's getting smaller. 99.6, 99.7, 99.8, 99.9%. You can barely see any height there. You have to really zoom in on it. But if I take this up to 100%, tax revenues are 0. Total income is 0. And that's because everyone, including Pharaoh's tax collectors, moved out of Egypt. That might be the case. All the drachmas were spent on camel-powered 3D movie theaters, but that's not the case. Nubians and Canaanites moved to Egypt because they love paying 100% tax rate. Well, that's not going to happen. Egyptians continue to work because they enjoy paying 100% tax rate. I doubt that's happening. Cleopatra spent all the drachmas on lavish party for her pet crocodiles. Well, I don't think that's going to happen. So everybody, including Pharaoh's tax collectors, probably moved out of Egypt. Another possibility is all this economic activity that once existed is now unofficial. It's illegal. It's off book. Suppose you observe the following Laffer curve during the rule, and it's not really called the Laffer curve. It's really the Ivan curve or Khaldun curve, right? During the rule of Al-Malik al-Zahir Barkuk, the first sultan of the Burji Mamluk dynasty. This is a fictional example. Click on Desmos to analyze this model. So we're going to open up Desmos, a new Desmos model. Before answering the following, change lines 1 and 2 in the model to your numbers, and my numbers are 116 for B, and A is minus 247. Change line 4 in the decimals model to T equal 100, and that's the tax rate of 100%. Change this to like 100 here, and change that to 0, and then push play. So it shows you what changing tax rates does to tax revenue. We'll go ahead and set it to 100 like we're instructed to in the lesson. That puts us at this point right here. If the tax rate is set at 100%, total tax receipts collected by the Sultan's government are shown in line 5 right here. So 0. And that agrees with the graph here. 100% tax rate, 0 revenue. The money at this time was called the dirham, and around 300 million of these silver coins circulated in 14th century Egypt. If the tax rate is set at 0%, then we're at this point right here. And line 5 is the tax revenue. So again, 0 dirham. Now we're going to just change the tax rates in Desmos and record the tax revenue. So at 5%, tax revenue is 256.46081. We want 3 decimal places. So 256.461. This 8 in the 4th spot makes the 0 in the 3rd spot 1 when we round it. If the tax rate is 19.47%, the revenue is 347.882. If the tax rate is 19.57, the tax revenue is 347.893. At 19.47, tax revenues aren't quite as high as they are at a tax rate of 19.57. What about 19.67? At 19.67, tax revenue is 347.899, higher than it was when the tax rate was 19.57. At 19.77, tax revenues are 347.901. I'll press enter to make sure these are correct. Then we have 19.87. It looks like tax revenues are starting to fall, 347.900. Looks like tax revenues reached a peak when the tax rate was 19.77. Now it looks like tax revenues are starting to fall. So this Laffer effect is kicking in. So at a tax rate of 19.97, tax revenues are 347.894. At 20.07%, tax revenues have dropped to 347.884 million. A 30% tax rate produces a revenue of 332.214. 50% is 255.6975. Because that's bigger than 50, that 7 becomes 8. So 255.698 million. And then we have the tax rate at 70%. And tax revenues are all the way down to 157.439 million. Press enter. The tax rate that maximizes the Sultan's tax revenue is what percent? So we said tax revenue is 347.901. So the tax rate that maximizes tax revenue is 19.77%. Why does raising a high tax rate lead to lower tax revenue? Higher taxes increase government efficiency. Not sure that's true. High taxes eliminate the need for tax collection. I don't think that's true. You need more enforcement. People work hard to pay taxes, higher taxes. That may be true, but I'm not too sure. High tax discourage work, investment, or push activity into underground markets. I would say that is the most correct answer. And you see it in present-day New York and in present-day California, where in both states, legal marijuana sales are heavily regulated and heavily taxed. And the black market in marijuana, the illegal marijuana in California or New York, is much larger than the legal market. And that's because these tax rates are so extremely high. To answer these questions here, click on that link, read this article, and then answer these boxes. And then when you get that done, click on this article, read this to answer these questions. And then finally, click on this article here. Read this article about Eric Garner and his experience with New York City police and the incredibly high tax rates on cigarettes that drive most of the cigarette market under the table in the black markets. Now, the next part is the U.S. Laffer curve. We're going to analyze the graphs and read the linked articles to fill in the answer boxes that follow. The blue line is per capita federal tax receipts here. The red line in the following graph shows the top marginal tax rate. It is the highest percentage of income tax applied to the highest income bracket in the U.S. progressive federal tax system. Our federal income tax system is progressive with multiple tax brackets. In 2025, the top marginal tax rate is 37%. For single federal tax filers, taxable income, income less retirement account contributions, student loan interest, health savings accounts, exemptions, and standard or itemized deductions, is taxed at the following rates. For income between $0 and just under $12,000 annually, you pay 10%. For incomes that are higher than that, and just under 50,000, you pay 12%. For incomes just below 50,000 to just above 100,000, you pay 22%. For incomes just above 100,000 and just below 200,000, you pay 24% income tax. And then for income that is just under 200,000 to right around 250,000, you pay 32%. Any income earned over 250 to 626,000, you pay a 35% rate. And then any income over 626,000, you pay a 37% rate. So a single person with $1 million in taxable income pays the IRS how many in dollars? Now this is taxable income. So this is income less your retirement account contributions, less your student loan interest, less your health savings accounts, less exemptions, less the standardized itemized deductions. So this is after all deductions. So this person has $1 million in taxable income. Well, to answer this question, we're going to have to pull out Excel again. And I'm going to type 10% here, 12%, 37%. Okay, so this person is making $1 million. So they're going to pay 10% on that first 11,925. So they're going to pay 10% on this first 11,925. They're making $1 million, so their income is definitely over 48,475. But they're not going to pay 12% on the entire 48,475. They're going to pay it on the difference between the 48,475 and 11,926. Now I need to put an equal sign here. So on the next 36,549, they're going to pay 12%. So I think to make this easier, I'm going to copy this into Excel. And then the characters that are letters or dollar signs, now they're going to pay 22% on the next $54,874. They're going to pay 24% on the difference in these two numbers. They're going to pay 24% on the next $93,949. They're going to pay 32% on the difference in these two income thresholds. So 32% on the next $53,224. And then they're going to pay 35% on income between $626,350 and $250,526. So they're going to pay 35% on the next $375,824. And then their taxable income is $1 million, but they don't pay 37% on that million. They pay 37% on the next, on the difference between $1 million, their taxable income, and the top income threshold of the top income bracket, $626,351. I say 351 because that $626,350th is taxed at 35%. The next dollar is taxed at 37%. So we have to type 351 there. And then I'm just going to drag this down. And then all we have to do now is sum. So this is going to be the tax that these people pay. The total tax they pay is $327,018.60. We're going to round that to 0 decimal places. So $327,019 in tax that this person pays. Now, for married couples filing jointly, the above income thresholds are higher at each marginal tax rate. Okay, next what I want to do is I want to download this data set. It's from what's called the FRED, Federal Reserve Economic Database. Column B is the blue line. Click on edit to see the calculation here. Federal government current receipts are in billions of dollars. Total population is in thousands of people. And the implicit price deflator is an index, which means when it says 100, it really means 1. So this is in percentages. This is in thousands. And this is in billions. So down here, when I take federal government current receipts and I divide it by the population, and then divide that by the GDP deflator to account for inflation, this number here is essentially a number that converts this into billions it converts this into thousands and it strips this of the percentages. And so you end up with thousands of dollars per American in column B. So in 1952, this number is adjusted for inflation, and these dollars are in 2017 dollars. The average American paid $3,145. In 2018, the average American paid almost $11,000 in federal income taxes. Then in column C is the top marginal tax rate. Right now, the top marginal tax rate is 37%, which is why down here this is 37. So we're going to graph the top marginal tax rate versus per capita federal tax receipts that have been adjusted for inflation. You can create this graph yourself by highlighting the two and then clicking insert and then choosing scatter plot. We have to fix the graph because the axis is mixed up. Excel treats the first column as the X values and the second column as the Y values. And we want the tax rate on the X axis and per capita federal tax receipts on the Y axis. So what we're going to do here is we're going to flip this. We're going to grab this blue box and put it over here temporarily. We're going to grab this purple box and put it underneath the top marginal tax rate. Then we're going to move this blue box to per capita federal tax receipts. And this is the graph that you see right here. And then we can right click, add a trend line, display equation, the R square. So the R square is quite high, 0.787. That means the variation in per capita federal tax receipts, 78.9% of that variation is explained by this linear model here. Your year might be different than mine. In 1978, the top marginal tax rate was 70%. And per capita tax receipts were what? 5,714. We're going to use 0 decimal places. So this 7 makes that 4 or 5. We'll press enter. Now we're going to calculate the square root of the R square. I'm just going to copy the R square here and then type equal square root SQRT, parentheses, I'm going to paste in that number, 0.7887. I get 0.8881, but we're going to use 2 decimal places. This is the correlation. We got to make it negative too because it's a downward sloping line. So it's a negative 0.89. It's pretty close to negative 1. The correlation of the two variables implies that lowering the top marginal tax rate is associated with greater per capita income tax revenue. If we lower the top marginal tax rate, we get higher per capita tax revenues. This correlation is pretty strong. Click this article and read about it. The red line in the graph above is the U.S.'s Laffer curve for the top marginal federal income tax rate. Its shape is best described by, now I'm comparing this shape to either this Laffer curve or this Laffer curve. This is the Laffer curve from the first part, then I have the Laffer curve of the second part. The first Laffer curve is symmetric in the range of 0 to 100%. The second Laffer curve is skewed. Its peak is skewed away from 100% tax rate. If you look at this, the 50% is right here in the middle. And so at 50%, tax revenues haven't peaked out yet. So this US Laffer curve looks more like this Laffer curve because at 50%, if you cut taxes, the revenues rise. In this Laffer curve, if you cut taxes from 50% to some lower percentage, tax revenues fall. So the US Laffer curve looks more like Laffer curve 2. The optimal tax rate for the US is probably then what? Well, we don't get anything lower than 20%. So it kind of looks like if we had some tax rates down here, maybe it would bend and come down. So the best guess for the optimal top marginal tax rate, it's not going to be 90. If you go from 90 to 80, you get higher tax revenues. It's not going to be 75% because if you go from 75% and cut tax rates, you're going to get higher tax revenue. At 50%, if you cut the tax rate, you're going to get higher tax revenues. We really can't say anything about 10% because we don't have any data, so we have to probably go with 30%. If we want to extract the most amount of revenue out of the economy, it looks like 30% is probably the tax rate that will extract the most from the economy. Now, to get the answer here and here, you'll need to read this article and that article. And I think it might surprise you what both were proposing. Now, we're going to complete this table here using the equation from the chart we created when we plotted the top marginal tax rate versus per capita tax receipts. To do that, I'm going to start by copying everything in this table. because it's an HTML table and I want to preserve the table format. When you do that, you want to copy something outside the table and everything inside the table. I'm going to right click on cell A1 and click match destination formatting. I'm going to word wrap the first row, maybe make it a little bigger. And then I'll double click inside one of these cells to auto fit the row. And then I'm going to get rid of the W. It was outside of the table. And it says complete the following table using the equation in the above graph. Well, that equation right here comes from our scatter plot, where this is the relationship between per capita tax receipts paid versus the top marginal tax rate. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to paste it right here. Then I'm going to delete the Y. The Y is the per capita tax receipts observed. What we're going to generate here is the expected value of per capita tax revenue based on the current top marginal tax rates under the Trump administration or under the Harris administration had she won. I want to change the X here to multiplication, and I'm going to click on cell B2. Then I'm going to drag this down. Now these numbers are identical because there's nothing in the blue cells here. It's plugging 0 into there. So it's multiplying 0 times that number, and then it's adding 0 to the intercept. And that's why you get these same numbers in these 4 boxes. The top marginal tax rate at the moment Trump was inaugurated, or at the moment Kamala Harris had been inaugurated to become the next president of the United States, had she won, would have been 37%. So this value here is 37, and this value here is 37%. This value here is what you found here by reading that article. This value here is what you entered here when you read that article. I'm going to leave that to you. Top marginal tax rate was 37% when Trump got inaugurated. It would have been the same value had Harris been inaugurated in January. So these two numbers are the same. We expect per capita tax revenue to be $8,650.8 no matter who is president. So I'm going to copy that here and here. I'm going to press enter. And I got all 4 of those numbers correct. Now, suppose you answered this 30%. Because Republicans like to give the rich tax cuts. And you answered this as 41% because Democrats like to tax the rich and make them pay a fair share. Then this would have been 30 and this would have been 41. So over here, I'm going to type 30 and I'm going to type here 41. And then this is the difference. And this is the difference. So if Trump's proposal was to lower it to 30 and Harris's proposal was to raise it to 41, what would have happened to per capita tax revenues? What would have happened to that expected value? Well, you got to go back to the Laffer curve, right? If you're starting around 37% and you lower the tax rate, what happens is people at the higher end of the income distribution, they're hiding less of their income legally from the United States government. There are legal ways to hide your income from the United States government. Or maybe they were hiding their income from the United States government in a legal way. But because the tax rate is lowered, that activity that had been illegal, not reported, now they feel okay reporting it. Or maybe they work 5 hours extra a week, and as a result, their incomes are higher. They're maybe not taking Friday off to play golf. Before he was governor of California and president of the United States, President Reagan was a Democrat. He was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He supported Democrat policies like setting the top marginal income tax rate at 90%. However, he soon realized why that was so problematic. When the top marginal tax rate was in the 90s, like it was in the 50s and early 60s, he would do movies for about a half a year. Because if he did any movies after July, all that additional income from doing additional movies or television series would go to the federal government. So he'd only work up until July, and then he'd take the rest of the year off. Because if he worked the entire year, all that additional income, 91% of it would go to the federal government. And then you had some going to the state of California. And JFK probably had that same realization because you see the tax rate cut from 91 to 77. A few years ago, I read an article by Thomas Sowell who wrote about the top marginal tax rate. And according to him, when top marginal tax rate was 91%, in 1 year, I forget what year it was. I don't think he mentioned what year it was, but there was 1 year where when the tax rate at the top end was 91%, there was like one guy in the United States who paid the 91%. Everybody else was trying to find ways around paying the 91%. And it could have been illegal or it could have been legal. One legal way to get around paying 91% tax rate is to make sure all your income is in the form of capital gains. So if you're running an investment bank, instead of taking a $1 million salary, you take a $1 salary or a $100,000 salary, and everything else is capital gains. And what are capital gains? If you own $1 million in stock and it goes up 2 million and you sell half of it, your capital gain is 1 million. And so one way to get around paying these high income tax rates is to have your salary income paid from capital gains. If Trump had proposed a 30% top marginal tax rate, per capita tax revenue, we'd expect it to go up. If Harris had proposed a 41% top marginal tax rate, expected per capita tax revenue would have fallen, and it would have fallen by that amount. Now, these numbers aren't the correct numbers because I'm going to go ahead and put them in, but I'm going to get these answers marked wrong. I'm using media narratives to answer these questions instead of what the candidates actually said. Now, I got them wrong because these aren't the actual numbers. Again, you have to read this article and that article to get these two answers so you can get those two answers. And then when these answers are correct and you insert them into these equations, you'll get the correct answer here and here. And I think you're going to be surprised about these two proposals. Which of the following is expected to occur if the top marginal tax rate is raised? Well, if the top marginal rate is raised, like it is from 37 to 41, expected per capita tax revenue falls.